Mike Memoli stepping into the leadership void today, both of the remaining Democratic candidates, both delivering addresses that were long on details, long on substance, with heavy emphasis on medicine and science. Take me through both of them from how you saw it. I know you're on the Biden beat, but I think all of us had our eyes on both candidates today.
Well, I mean, Nicole, if Joe Biden is not going to be able to continue to campaign in the way you traditionally would, and all indications are that's going to be the case for this foreseeable future. What you saw, at least from Joe Biden today, is something I think you're going to see a lot more over the next few weeks, which is essentially the campaign presenting Joe Biden to the country as shadow president, modeling not just what Joe Biden would do if he was elected president, but what Americans expect, frankly, from a typical president, a traditional presidency, and what they're not seeing right now in the White House with Donald Trump. And I was struck, as you know, so much about politics is timing and being able to meet the moment. And as I was watching this morning, as the markets were tanking and Congress was struggling to come together on some sort of legislative response to this, I had a deja vu moment thinking back, and I hesitate almost to bring this up for fear of triggering bad memories with you, but to when I covered Joe Biden in the 2008 campaign when he was running for vice president. One of the defining moments of that campaign was with the financial collapse. And obviously John McCain chose to suspend the campaign, go back to Washington. The Obama campaign at that time chose to continue to campaign. Obviously, Obama did go back to Washington, but Biden is familiar with this role. He went out on the campaign trail to talk about not just what they would do if they were in the White House, but to attack John McCain for his reaction to it, to talk about how he was acting erratically, lurching. And this was also something he did in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy sidelined President Obama, forced him to stay in Washington. Joe Biden was able to go out and continue the work of a campaign, but also offer assurance that they were dealing with this emergency moment. And so that's, I think, what in very much uncharted territory right now, Joe Biden has some comfort level in dealing with this. And then quickly on Bernie Sanders, I think what's so interesting for him and what potentially the last
let me just add a headline and then I'll let you keep going. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio has declared a state of emergency in this city. Bill de Blasio, obviously an enthusiastic supporter of the Sanders campaign as well. So just with another proof point that things are, as Tony Fauci said on Capitol Hill today, very much going to get worse before they get better. Take us through the Sanders speech. Sorry, Mike.
Sure, of course. No. And for Sanders, this was an opportunity. Obviously, he saw what the president did last night, and knowing that Joe Biden was going to hold this speech that he had today, was on the books for a couple days, needing to meet the moment his as well. And this for a candidate who may not be in this race much longer, certainly Biden on a path to clinch the nomination or at least take an insurmountable lead very soon. He was able to do what we talked a little bit about yesterday, which is put forward his issues, talk about how in a country in which Medicare for all is the law of the land, we would not be seeing issues like we're seeing now, which is the lack of ability to get testing, a surge in medical resources. So an important opportunity for Sanders as well to show what his vision for government would mean as well.
Mike Memoli, thank you very much on the Biden beat for us. Alexi McCammon, Axios, I think, broke the news, or at least broke the first report that I read about the botched production of tests for coronavirus at a lab in Atlanta, I believe. And you guys have had some incredible reporting on the federal response and on the White House. Take me through your understanding at this hour of how this speech came to be last night, a speech with 3 corrections around policy, not just misstatements, but things that were potentially drafted incorrectly in the president's speech. And then an Oval Office spray. I've made a decision not to air either one of those until the White House is done correcting them in terms of substance, because there is still a problem with getting the facts nailed down before the president opens his mouth.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Nicole. President Trump's speech from the Oval Office last night was riddled with misinformation. And, that's because throughout this entire process, President Trump has clearly been unwilling to listen to the facts around coronavirus and face the realities of this ever-changing and quickly changing situation. I'm not saying that the president should have known exactly the severity of the situation when it first unfolded, but he has a team of people around him who have been giving him information that he either is not trusting or is bad information. misinformation. And that matches, unfortunately, the spread of misinformation and intentional disinformation around coronavirus that we're seeing really take off online. So the American people are confronted with misinformation around coronavirus, both online and offline, with the president himself. I mean, you mentioned at the top of this show that there were 3 major parts of his speech last night that had to be literally corrected either by the president himself or administration officials afterwards. And the most alarming one to me was the last of those 3, which is that he said that health insurance companies would be writing off and waiving copays for coronavirus treatments. That's just not true. It's for coronavirus testing. And while testing could be an expensive part of this for people, testing is great, but if you find out that you have coronavirus and then you find out after the president said otherwise that you have to pay for the treatment, that's a big blow that a lot of people might not be able to afford. And so it's a really dangerous thing when you look at the way in which President Trump, as we've seen from him with other things, whether that's healthcare or immigration or any number of things, he is not someone who sticks to the facts because the facts don't often help his narrative. And I'm not saying that he's intentionally omitting facts because it doesn't help him, but we know that something like a global pandemic is not great for the incumbent president, and especially one that is looking like it could lead to an economic recession. That has got to be something that is freaking President Trump out.
I agree with Alexi's analysis, but while a pandemic is something that nobody plans for, actually a lot of people do plan for it. Most White Houses and State Departments and Homeland Security Departments and CIAs and FBIs do plan for things like this. I do not know if this White House ever practiced this. The White House I was in did in preparation for the bird flu. I know that the Obama administration dealt with a lot of this with Ebola and bird flu. I think swine flu also either happened during the administration in which I served or the one in which you served. But what Trump is suffering isn't blame for the coronavirus. I don't think any rational person blames him for the arrival of the coronavirus on our shores. What he is suffering now is a credibility crisis of his own making. And when I looked at that speech of what to show, there have been 3 major policy corrections delivered to that speech and counting. There are corrections being delivered to the comments he made in the Oval Office. He is now, and not that he was ever a careful communicator, he is now spreading disinformation around something around which people are desperate. I cannot tell you how many people have called me and said, should I get on a plane and go to spring break? Should I send my kid to school? It's not closed yet. Should my kid go to baseball? Should my kid go to ballet? Can we go to the movies? People are desperate for credible information.
Yes, and as you know, an Oval Office address is like the 10 Commandments, that those words are golden and should be checked over and over. And in fact, he doesn't have that classic sort of process to do that and doesn't even know how to do it. Remember, he used to lambast people for taking notes. The other thing that's ironic about it and sad and a little bit dangerous is he now has to depend on a system that he doesn't trust. He has to depend on the deep state. He has to depend on healthcare professionals, on public health professionals. This is what government is. It's an unwieldy jalopy, but you have to use it all the same. And he has no idea how to use it. And in fact, one of the things that Joe Biden mentioned today that I think is important to mention over and over. Look at how the states and localities and governors are going into action.
Let me just inject. I just got some new information. So since we came on the air, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio has declared a state of emergency, and this might be why. There are now 95 cases in New York, 42 new cases since yesterday.
So the reason that states and localities are important is those guys and women, they have to deliver for their people. And the other thing that Biden mentioned that's so important is all of these states have balanced budgets amendments, that they have to balance their budget. They need to spend billions and billions of dollars to help people, and they need federal relief. Trump did not mention anything like that at all, in part because people in his administration don't seem to understand how government works and the difference between the federal government, the state government, and localities.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.